Hello and welcome back to another episode of IOHR Human Rights TV. The right to nationality is the most well-entrenched principle of human rights law. Statelessness is the most acute violation of this fundamental universal principle of human rights. In 2018, there are over 10 million people worldwide who are not considered a national by any state under the operation of its law, and 1/3 of these are young children. With us today, we have Amal De Chickera, the coordinator of the Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion, an NGO that advocates for the right of the stateless. Amal, good to have you with us. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm very happy to be here, thank you.
Now, statelessness occurs for a variety of reasons. I'm sure our viewers watching, the thought of not being protected by any state is simply unimaginable. Can you explain to us how something like this can actually happen?
Well, we found in our work that the underlying reason for statelessness in most instances is discrimination. So you find that people are discriminated against on various grounds, and this does lead to statelessness. One example which is often spoken about is gender discrimination. So there are 25 countries in the world which do not allow women to pass on nationality to their children in the same way that men are allowed to, and this can lead to statelessness. But you also have very large minority communities, the Rohingya from Myanmar being the most famous, but there are others as well, Kurds in Syria, Haitians, or Dominicans of Haitian origin in the Dominican Republic, and I can go on. And these are all groups who have been denied their nationality, they're denied their right to belong to a state because they belong to an ethnic or a religious or other kind of minority. When you look at the way the UNHCR and various other actors have categorized the causes of statelessness, you would find that one of the causes is the conflict of laws, which is where the nationality laws of two countries are not compatible, and that can result in statelessness when people from these two countries marry each other and have children. But you also find state succession, for example, is given as a cause of statelessness. But one of the reasons we say at the Institute that discrimination is the real underlying factor is that in the context of state succession, be it in the context of colonialism or in the context of a large state splitting up into two or more successor states, you find that it is the unwanted minority, the group that has a migrant history, which is denied nationality. So you have ethnic Russians of Latvia, you have Hill country Tamils in Sri Lanka, and you can go on. So these are some of the causes of statelessness. I think it's worth emphasizing that in the world today, the biggest cause of statelessness is the inheritance of statelessness. And what I mean by this is that at some point in history, because of bad law, because of poor implementation of the law, because of lack of registration, whatever it may be, people became stateless. But the reason people remain stateless and the reason that children and grandchildren inherit statelessness is because there isn't the political will to address this problem. And so we have situations in Kuwait, for example, with the Bidun, where a census in the 1960s resulted in the counting of Kuwaiti citizens. And everyone who missed that census was known as Bidun, without. But now we are 2-3 generations down the line, and the children and grandchildren of those people who missed the census still remain without nationality.
According to international law, stateless people simply don't exist. They don't have an identity. Presumably, without an identity, if you don't exist, you are incredibly vulnerable and open to all kinds of human rights violations.
You are. Hannah Arendt famously said that the right to nationality is the right to have rights. Now, this is a position which I think is a very good descriptor of the situation. However, I would contest it as a normative position, because normatively every person has human rights as inherent to them being human beings. It doesn't derive from your nationality. If you look at the main human rights treaties, the international covenants on civil and political rights or socio-economic rights, or the various other the treaties on child rights or gender, etc., you find that the vast majority of rights are reserved for all people. There are a very few rights, such as the right to vote, the right to seek and contest election, for example, which are reserved only for people who have citizenship. So we have this imbalance where we have a normative framework which sets out that everyone has the right to a nationality, and everyone, regardless of whether or not they have a nationality, has other human rights. But in reality, we find that those who are stateless, who've been denied their right to a nationality, are at a disadvantage when it comes to actually enjoying and accessing other rights as well. We see this largely in the context of accessing socioeconomic rights, so the right to education and healthcare, a livelihood and a place to live. But we also see it in terms of the exercise of civil and political rights. And it's a huge problem, and again it goes to the heart of the issue, which is discrimination, where statelessness becomes an added factor to justify and to base the discrimination and exclusion of certain people.
It's estimated that there are 10 million stateless people around the globe. What is the international community doing, if anything, to help these people?
So the UNHCR estimates that there are 10 million people. It's important to say that this is an estimate that is based on data around some 3.5 million people, and the rest is a rough guess based on where we know there are large stateless populations. It's also important to emphasize that we at the Institute actually look at a larger figure of approximately 15 million. And the reason we do this is because the UNHCR data excludes stateless refugees, and it also excludes stateless Palestinians under the UNRWA mandate.
That's a big discrepancy, isn't it? 10 and 15 million.
It is a big discrepancy, and I think we feel that it's important to include stateless refugees and stateless Palestinians in the number, because when you look at refugees who are also stateless, they face additional vulnerabilities, and it's important to take into account their statelessness when trying to resolve their situations. So we feel that not including these people in this number could result in protection challenges down the line. But coming back to your question of what the international community is doing about it, it depends very much on whether you're a half glass full or half glass empty type of person. So for a long time, the statelessness issue was the neglected issue in the international human rights and humanitarian fields. It is the UNHCR which has the mandate to work on statelessness and to protect stateless people and to work with governments to prevent and reduce statelessness. But you find that this mandate was really taken on with a lot of enthusiasm post 2005, 2006. So we have a convention which was ratified or which was passed in 1954. And we have that convention being largely dormant for a good 50 years before we saw the international community galvanizing around this issue. But still, even if you look at what's happening today, there is a lot of action, there's a lot of momentum, but it remains one of the more under-resourced, one of the less understood issues in human rights law, and much more needs to be done, both from the perspective of UN agencies and civil society organizations, but also from the perspective of governments, which ultimately have the power to address the situation, but also lack the political will to do so.
The 1961 UN Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness was adopted to prevent and minimise statelessness around the world. Can you tell me if this measure is a success, and what are the obligations of countries who have signed up to this convention?
It hasn't been very successful. So the UNHCR estimates that there's a child born stateless every 10 minutes as an indication of how unsuccessful, we may say, the 61 convention has been. The convention itself has some very strong language in there and some very sensible safeguards. And a lot of this has been replicated by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, as our viewers would know, is almost universally ratified. So there's a very strong legal basis to say that no child should be born stateless in the world today. And it's a very simple principle, which is that if a child would otherwise be stateless, the child should get the nationality of the country in which the child was born. So it's a very simple safeguard, which if implemented in earnestness and with sincerity by all states, we would eradicate statelessness in a generation. but we don't see that happening, and in fact we see more children being born stateless every day.
The UK adopted the UN Convention. What's the application process like for stateless people living in the UK? How easy is it for them, and do they have people to help them?
So the UK actually adopted a procedure to identify stateless people as recently as 2013, and this arose out of a process by which an organization called Asylum Aid and the UNHCR jointly conducted a mapping study on statelessness, and they identified certain challenges which they put to the state with a solution, which is that here are people who largely remain outside of the system. Because they are stateless, it's difficult to remove them from the country. By acknowledging their status and protecting them, you would be able to move forward. And so it was a very welcome moment in 2013 when the UK adopted the statelessness determination procedure. But we see 4 years down the line that things haven't panned out quite as well as they could have, or as we expected or hoped.
As of 2013, Ivory Coast had some 700,000 stateless people living within its borders. It was one of the biggest stateless population anywhere in the world. And then the introduction of a new citizenship law in October 2013 has seen 22,000 of these people applying for Ivorian citizenship. What are your thoughts on the success of this as a case study? And could you see this being rolled out to other countries where statelessness is endemic?
So the Côte d'Ivoire it's an interesting case study actually in the causes and consequences of statelessness. So you have two main causes of statelessness in the country. One was when it was a colony. There were populations forcibly brought to Côte d'Ivoire from neighboring countries. And these populations remained in Côte d'Ivoire even after independence, but they weren't necessarily recognized or accepted as Côte d'Ivoire. And the second reason is that when Côte d'Ivoire got its independence in I think it was 1960 or 61, its nationality law allowed people to obtain citizenship through two pathways. One was by descent, so if your parents are Côte d'Ivoirean, you are Côte d'Ivoirean, and the other was by birth on the territory. And the second category was a very useful one for the children of migrants and for orphans who could not prove who their parents were. In 1972, this second category was removed, and the only pathway to citizenship was through descent. And it's these two factors which together created this situation where 700,000 plus people were without citizenship.
What do you think is the main risk of returning the Rohingya to Myanmar if they continue to be stateless? Is this even a possibility?
Quite shockingly, Bangladesh and Myanmar actually signed an agreement to repatriate Rohingya to Myanmar. And under the schedule that they agreed, Rohingya the repatriation process should have started in January. Now this didn't happen because there have been certain problems between the two states, but the fact that it is being considered and acted on is a massive indictment on Bangladesh. I wouldn't expect any better from Myanmar, but also the international community. What's basically happened is, without any real change to the ground situation, we still have people being targeted in Myanmar. We still have stories of people trying to flee across the border. The fact that it's considered okay to supposedly voluntarily return these people it actually is astounding. And we have a situation where the European Union congratulated Bangladesh and Myanmar on coming to this agreement. So I think it points to a catastrophic failing at international community level. My organization, the Institute, in October last year, in anticipation that this may happen, we published a brief comment on this very issue, and we identified 6 conditions that would have to be met before it's even possible to think about repatriation. And one of those conditions was addressing the statelessness of the Rohingya and recognizing them as citizens. Now, the reason we feel this is important, and many people may argue that it's unrealistic to to push for recognition of citizenship given what's happened right now. But the reason we feel it's important is because if this fundamental issue is not addressed, we will just see a repeat of history, what happened in 1978, what happened in 1991, etc., where people are pushed back again into a situation in which they are persecuted, they are discriminated against, they are excluded, building the way for them to be again sent out or pushed out of the country. Now, addressing this issue alone certainly isn't enough. There are questions around accountability, there are questions around safety, there are questions around ensuring that these two communities are able to build their lives together again. So there are many things that need to happen, and it's going to be extremely difficult to achieve any sort of sense of normalcy. But yeah, I'm just astounded that it's being considered as soon as it is.
The power of the state has grown significantly during this war on terror. Turkey, for instance, has threatened to rescind the citizenship of nationals living abroad since the failed coup in 2016. Do you see this with other countries trying to deprive their nationals of their citizenship, all under the umbrella of national security?
Yeah, this is another area that we at the Institute are concerned about, and we are monitoring quite closely along with some of our other partner organizations as well. We see the state increasingly giving itself the power to strip citizenship of its own people, and apparently this is done in the name of national security, like you said, or in the name of the war against terrorism. But we also find, two things. Firstly, that in itself is problematic and questionable. How effective is it if you are really concerned with national security? How effective a tool is stripping nationality? The better way to deal with such people is through due process of the law in their own country, rather than exporting the problem to somewhere else.
You mentioned earlier on that every 10 minutes a stateless child is born somewhere in the world. What's been done in particular to deal with child statelessness?
Yeah, it's a very important issue. If I can just turn to this photograph, this is a fantastic picture taken by Greg Constantine, and I noticed a few of his pictures on the background as I was speaking. He's a photographer who's worked on statelessness for the last 10 or 12 years, and I would encourage everyone to look at his project Nowhere People, which looks at statelessness around the world. So this picture is of a Roma population, a Roma family rather, in Serbia. And in Serbia, we have Roma as an ethnic minority who are at greater risk of statelessness than any other group. And the reason is because they find it more difficult to access birth registration. And the lack of birth registration is often, it's not the same as statelessness, because there are many millions of people in the world who don't have birth registration documents. But it's certainly, particularly if you belong to a minority whose belonging may be questioned by the state, it is a factor. If you cannot prove where you are from, who your parents are, where you were born, then you are more likely to be considered to be stateless.
Tell me about the programs that the Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion have in place to help stateless people.
So we are a relatively young organization. We are around 3 years old. I am one of the 3 co-founders of the organization. And the reason we set the institute up was because we had been working on statelessness for different organizations, the 3 of us. And we were getting increasingly frustrated by the fact that there was no one organization set up to work on statelessness globally. By comparison, it's a similar size population, but if you look at the refugee field, there are so many organizations and so many resources, much needed resources, available for this issue. So we set the institute up with very much the idea of being an NGO that is there as an NGO for NGOs. So we work with partner organizations around the world, with the various regional statelessness networks, in collaboration with them, to make human rights submissions to treaty bodies, to conduct research, to do advocacy. We do a lot of training and capacity building. We're increasingly working directly with stateless people and stateless populations themselves. So we are we have big ambitions, but we've started off small, and we hope that we would be making an impact as we go along.
Now, you just mentioned statelessness and Sweden in the one sentence, and you don't normally put the two of them together. Can you tell me a bit more?
Yeah, you wouldn't normally associate Sweden with statelessness. And I think it's important to emphasize that probably the reason Sweden is on that list is because it's better at maintaining statistics. So you have a large immigrant population which is stateless or at risk of statelessness. And there are big concerns here about the Swedish nationality law framework and the fact that the children of these immigrants are also stateless. So there are problems, but you would find, I think, that if other countries in Western Europe, for example, if they kept as good statistics as Sweden, that many of them would be on this list as well.
The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has instigated a plan that aims to eradicate statelessness by 2024. 2024, it's not that far away. How realistic do you think this goal is? And what mechanisms are in place to ensure that they actually reach this goal?
It's a good question. I think it's important to look at the UNHCR I Belong campaign and its global action plan, and to understand it in terms of where the issue of statelessness was when the campaign was being conceived and where it is now. And what you see is, by announcing this extremely ambitious, some would say unrealistic goal, UNHCR has managed to put statelessness on the global agenda. It's now on the map, it's spoken about more. One parallel I like to draw is the Millennium Development Goals, which had many problems with them, and both in terms of how they were conceived, but also in terms of the actual logic behind some of them and the way they were implemented. But what the Millennium Development Goals did was it drew attention to the problem of poverty and development, and it galvanized resources, it galvanized political will. Some would say not enough, but it certainly gave the issue a boost.
A fascinating subject, and one we could obviously talk about for much longer. For viewers watching at home that would like to know more or would like to help, what can they do?
Well, if you would like to know more, educate yourself. There are a lot of good resources on statelessness. I would point you to our website, but I would also point you to other good resources on the subject matter. The UNHCR website itself, it has a separate website for its statelessness work. Some of our partner organizations, there are various regional networks on statelessness in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas. And at country level, depending on where you are from, there are various actors and organizations doing very good work at country level. If you're from a country which has a large stateless population, get in touch with them. They're getting increasingly organized and better at advocating their cause.
Great. Amal De Chickera, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of Human Rights TV, bringing human rights into focus. You can keep up to date on our website or social media. Join us again next time. Until then, goodbye.